You can just use mine. I'll take from my seat.
We're on. We're good. Thank you for bearing with us.
Sure thing. It looks like you're our chairman for the day.
It looks like we have about 15 people from the community here. Are we ready to start?
I think we're ready to start.
Okay, great. Well, it's good to see a few friendly faces and to know that there's others of you are out there. And we just want to thank you very much for taking the time to learn about this really important housing initiative that we're embarking on. So it's an interesting place where we're at because the state has mandated that we ensure that there's sufficient capacity in town so that new housing can be developed. Yet the town itself, we're not responsible for constructing any housing. So this plan is really about, or this initiative, what we're working on right now is kind of coming up with a plan and your vision. So I hope that you can set aside time over the next few months to attend a few of these meetings. We really need your input. We want your vision because this is really about what is Moraga going to look like in the future? What is housing in Moraga going to look like in the future? And that means like, what is housing going to look like when you want to retire and maybe you don't want to be in your single family house anymore? And what's housing going to look like if your kids want to come back here and they want to raise their families here? So these are all super important questions. You guys are the ones who live here and we want to hear from you. So thank you for showing up. And I also wanted to let you know that the Planning Commission and the Town Council have already heard this presentation. And because of Brown Act concerns, they are really not able to show up today. But they're all interested in what you have to say. And like I said, they've heard it before, but they're going to be watching the videos and we'll be presenting the input to them. So thank you for sharing and thank you so much for being here. And hopefully we'll see you again in the near future. And I'll turn it over to you all.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And good afternoon and welcome to the Town of Moraga's first virtual community conversation about housing. As Cynthia pointed out, there's certainly a lot to understand here. This is one of several meetings and we'll be holding in the next few weeks more discussions and talks about housing in our town, recent state laws and requirements related to housing, new policies, regulations that the town will need to develop over the next year to address the housing needs. We'll be having another meeting like this one on Thursday, October 28th at 6:30 p.m. So I'm requesting that you please share the information with your social circles and ask them to attend. And our town council will be talking about housing legislation on October 27th and affordable housing tools on November 17th. And then on November 18th, we'll have another community-wide meeting to discuss the specific topic of affordable housing again. So there'll be additional conversations that will stem from these throughout winter and spring months as we prepare a document that is called the housing element. And then for those who are here, we'd like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded and town's website, Make Moraga Home. So those that weren't able to join us today can also continue to learn about this project. And importantly, I do want to share that translation services are available and please contact us either prior to this meeting or on an ongoing basis after this meeting at 925-888-7040, and we would be happy to conduct this. Next slide, please.
Afshak, may I confirm that what you're seeing on your screens is the PowerPoint presentation for today and not the 3 screens that I'm seeing in front of me. If you could just let me know that what you're seeing is the PowerPoint.
Yes, I'm seeing the PowerPoint.
Terrific.
Okay. So we'll be telling you more about the housing element in this presentation, and I really appreciate all the energy and the enthusiasm and just, all of you taking time out today to come. And before we get started, my name is Afsha Hamid. I'm planning director. I've been with the town for about 1.5 years, and I'm really excited to be here in Moraga. I am a resident of Contra Costa County, and I am really excited to work on this project with you. And then today, we're going to start off with a brief presentation that provides the context for the housing element. In other words, how we got here and why we're here today. The presentation provides an overview of what a housing element is and the process that the town will be going through it, and more importantly, how you can be involved. We'll have an opportunity for questions and discussions at the end of the presentation and look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas with us. And today we want to encourage you to type your questions or comments in the chat window during the presentation. And we'll have an exercise in just a moment to practice that. And really what's really important here is to share your housing story with us. So please email us at makeMoragaHome@moraga.ca.us. We do have a dedicated email address for this project, and we welcome your ideas and messages at that address. And then all emails will be answered. More importantly, I want to do some introductions. And can we go to the next slide, please? So there's a lot of staff, town staff that are involved in this, and we each have a different role. And some staff will be here today, but they may be also in the town offices at some point, or they may come to a different meeting. But I just, as general, want to introduce everybody. So you've already had some welcoming comments from Cynthia Battenberg, town manager. My name is Afsha Hamid again, and I'm the planning director. Brian Horn is the associate planner. Neil Mendez is the assistant planner, and Susie Mele is our administrative assistant. And we have a team of consultants, and it's Barry Miller, and he's the project manager, and he will be leading this effort. Matt Kauta with BAE Urban Economics. And then there's some more consultants that are on this team as well. And the consultants are Rincon, Farron Pierce, and Aaron Welch. And we're all working as a team to support this initiative. So you will hear all of our different names at some point during this project. So thank you, and let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to Barry.
Great. Thank you, Afsha. And this slide is particularly appropriate right now. Technology happens. Please be flexible and patient. We are having some technical challenges on our end right now. One of the things we're going to be doing in this meeting is a couple of Zoom polls. So bear with us. We may have to, oh, they're back. Okay. We will be doing some Zoom polls in just a moment. We're using some unfamiliar equipment here. So first of all, as Afsha said, please use the chat function to type questions and comments throughout the presentation. We're asking that you hold your verbal comments until after the presentation. We'll be talking for about 30 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of the time in a conversation with Q&A with all of you. We are also asking that you use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak. In the reactions window, please lower your hand after speaking. The way you find the raise hand feature, if you don't see it on your menu, is you go to the reactions section on the bottom tab of the Zoom screen, and there should be an option to raise your hand. And then if you click it again, it will lower your hand. We're asking that you please have your microphone on mute during the presentation, and also that you feel free to share your video screen so that we can stay visually connected. You don't have to do that during the presentation, but when we're through and we're all speaking and we're all on the screen, it's great to see who's who. Please do respect each other's opinions. We know we have diverse views on this subject, which is a good thing. And this is really intended to be a listening session. And also, it's our first meeting. So again, bear with us through the technology, and we will be providing many more opportunities for input throughout the process. We have an email address, which is at the bottom left, makemoraga@moraga.ca.us. We want to encourage you to submit comments in writing to that email address. If there's something that we are talking about that sparks an idea, please do email us if you don't have a chance to type your question in the chat window.
Barry, I can't find the chat window. I don't have a chat window on the bottom.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it on this screen either. And again,
Yeah, Barry, I'm not able to access the chat feature.
okay, we may not be able to use the chat feature during this meeting, in which case we're just going to have to rely on raising hands and speaking at the end. It's possible that when the screen share is over that we'll be able to see the chat feature, but it doesn't appear on my Zoom screen either. Okay.
It may be disabled.
Let's just go on to the next slide. Okay, we are going to ask a Zoom polling question here. We'd like to know where the participants on this call live. I think there are about 25 of you here. And if you own a home in Moraga, please click that first choice. If you rent a room or home, the second choice. If you live somewhere else in the county, the third choice, none of the above. And we'll give folks a few more minutes to click on the answer to this one. Looks like we've got about 20 who have responded. And I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So about 80% of you are Moraga homeowners, and 2 are renters in the community, and 2 live elsewhere in Contra Costa County. So we're going to go to another Zoom poll now. And this one is about where you work. And again, we are going to bring up the poll question. And everyone should be able to see options on the screen. Okay, we have a good balance here. About, looks like most of you are working in Moraga. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and we'll share the results. So 42% of you work in Moraga, 21% work outside of Moraga. About a quarter of you are not currently working, and about 10% are other. So we'll go on. We have 2 more of these polling questions before we jump into our presentation. This is how long have you lived in Moraga? And we have a number of options here. You can go ahead and respond. And we'll end the poll there. So it looks like most of you have lived here for a long time, more than 20 years, 60% of those who responded, if not 58%. So a lot of longtime residents here today with us. Thanks for being here. We've got one more polling question. And that is, what is your age? And let's bring that up. Okay, we're going to end the poll there, and we've got 40% are 65 or older, 26% 50 to 64, 21% 35 to 49, and 11% 18 to 34. So we got a good cross section across age groups here. And let's go on to, I think we're going to skip the next slide where we were going to test the chat, since we appear to not have the chat feature in for most of what people are seeing on their screens. And we're going to move right in to a discussion of why we're here today. And I'm going to turn it over to Afsha at this point.
Okay, and Barry, before I begin, is there a way to make the presentation take up the entire screen? Because we can see no notes. And next slide.
What I'm seeing on my, I see. Let's try to do that. If you want to go ahead and begin, I will try to adjust that.
Okay, sure. So this slide really asks a fundamental question, which is, why are we here today? And, you know, one of the reasons is that the state of California mandates that we update our housing. Thank you, Barry, that's perfect.
Okay, great.
Now we can see the entire screen, perfect. So this is a really fundamental question. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because the state of California mandates that we update our housing cycle every 8 years. And there's a lot of consequences if we don't update them, including lawsuits, increased loss of local control. And instead of doing our housing element every 8 years, we would be required to do it every 4 years. And of course, the fees that we have to do on a monthly basis, which I think are approximately 100,000 every month if we don't adopt it in time. So there's a lot of reasons why we're here today. And we thought it would be helpful to start our conversation with a presentation and give you some context about what housing is. So Barry, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So during the last 10 years, the 9 Bay Area counties added approximately 1.3 million jobs. At the same time, we produced 140,000 units of housing. Or roughly 1 housing unit for every 9 jobs that were created in the 9 Bay Area, in the 9 Bay Area counties. The blue bars on this chart show the number of jobs each Bay Area county added between 2010 and 2019. The orange bars show the number of housing units each county added. You can see the ratio of jobs to housing added above each set of bars. And in Contra Costa County, we added about 109,000 jobs during the decade, and we built 18,000 housing units, or roughly 1 housing unit for every 6 jobs that were created. We did a little better than the region as a whole, but there's still a huge imbalance that is region-wide. And as you can see on the slide, all of the Bay Area counties added significantly more jobs than homes, in some cases by margins of 15-1. And although Santa Clara, San Francisco, and Alameda County saw the majority of the job growth, we've all been impacted by the imbalance. By growing our economy without adding housing, we've seen longer commutes, more overcrowding of households, and doubling up of households, and significant increases in housing prices. Next slide. Now, this is not just about the tech boom. It's the growth of high income jobs at Google and Facebook and other large employers in Silicon Valley. So it's not just about those jobs that we tend to think of. The growth of these higher income jobs has also fueled growth in lower paying jobs that we hear less about in the news. Jobs in the service industries and in the middle income professions like healthcare, education, and the creative arts. Jobs in retail, food service, childcare, and other sectors that don't pay as well as technology jobs that are driving the boom. On this chart, The orange bars show the number of jobs created by income category in the Bay Area. And you can see we're doing a better job building housing for those in the above moderate income categories and these are the tech jobs and the higher paying jobs. We're not doing nearly as well when it comes to building housing for those in the middle income and low income categories. In fact, very little of the housing we're built in the last decade is affordable to these workers, creating a large and growing gap in our housing market. Next slide. So what does the lack of supply mean for higher prices? When you have an imbalance between supply and demand, as we've seen here, one of the consequences and it is an increase in prices. This graph shows the median home value in Moraga over the last decade based on data from Zillow. We've seen an increase of more than 100% since 2012 alone in the town, with the median price increasing from $850 9 years ago to over 1.8 million today. While rents haven't gone up quite as steeply, we've also seen rents increase at a faster rate than income. Next slide. So we're not building for the missing middle, and I will explain what that means. Another factor behind high housing costs is that we're not building for what we sometimes call the missing middle of the housing market. The missing middle includes townhomes, duplexes, smaller apartment buildings, and other types of housing that used to be more common in our cities and town than today. We've seen construction of costly single-family homes at one end of the market and larger apartment and condominium complexes at the other. But what we haven't seen lately is the moderate density, more reasonably priced housing that's always been an important part of the housing market. We have seen good examples in the town in past, and some of the existing examples are like the duplexes at Moraga Country Club. So they do exist, but they haven't been done in the last number of cycles. Opportunities for first-time home buyers and young families are more limited than they used to be. And in Moraga, data shows that our townhomes and condos are selling for roughly 1/2 of the sales price of single-family homes. But there is very little inventory available. Next slide, please. And this slide is about our service workers who can't afford to live here anymore. And this is about Contra Costa County. One of the consequences of these changes is that our service workers are having a harder and harder time living in our community and in the Bay Area as a whole. This table shows the average wage in a number of jobs and occupations in Contra Costa County. What you also see is the percentage of one's annual income that is needed to afford the median priced 1-bedroom apartment in central Contra Costa County. So if you're a preschool teacher, for example, living in a 1-bedroom unit, you may need to spend 74% of your income on your rent and utilities. If you're a police officer, you may need to spend 40% of your income on rent and utilities. So overall, it's getting harder and harder to make ends meet and have income left over for food, transportation, medical costs, and other expenses. Next slide. So the benefits of increased housing choices, there are some real benefits to having a more diverse mix of housing choices in our community. We can create more opportunities for young families to buy a first-time home, something that's out of the reach for many families with children right now. Think about whether you could afford to live in the home that you live in today and may have raised your children in if the cost was 1.8 or 1.9 million at the time you purchased it. We can provide places for our kids to live as young adults. Right now, we know that many of our kids will not be able to live in Moraga as adults because there are no affordable options for them. We can also provide more options for seniors, making it easier to age in the community instead of moving to Rossmore or Lafayette or somewhere else with more choices for older adults. For example, buildings with elevators or single living space units, or spaces that are a little smaller and require less maintenance than a large single-family home. We can also help people who work in the community, like faculty at St. Mary's, or employees at Safeway, or local restaurants or local firefighters find housing locally instead of commuting for an hour each way. And that shorter commute can also translate into less traffic, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, which helps us to achieve our climate goals for the future. And we can create a stronger, more balanced community that are inclusive and complete and provide a great place where everyone is welcome. Next slide, please. So why isn't the housing we need getting built? When you look at the data, one question that comes up right away is, why isn't the housing getting built? And there's no one answer to that question. We're facing a complicated set of challenges that makes it very difficult to find a solution. And no one city or town can solve the problem on its own. It's a regional issue and also a statewide issue, and we have to solve it together. We have some of the factors are shown here, but we have a limited amount of buildable land. Bay Area residents cherish open spaces and natural environments, and that makes our region a beautiful and desirable place to live. We've preserved our hillsides and our wetlands and much of our farmland, and we've developed most of the flat, easier sites decades ago. What we're left with are mostly small sites that have been skipped over by development, or are already developed sites that are underused or maybe repurposed. It's much harder to develop these sites than vacant lands. We also have a fiscal structure that favors commercial and industrial development over housing. Cities rely on sales taxes, hotel taxes, business taxes, and other revenue sources that come from these types of jobs. And they often have policies that favor jobs over housing due to fiscal impacts and the higher cost of providing services to residential areas. We also have high land and construction costs. The cost of lumber has increased more than 300% in the last year alone. The cost of labor is high. Other building materials are more expensive than they used to be. And the price of land is very expensive, especially where sites may have been used before and need a demolition and cleanup before development. Our environmental review and project review are absolutely critical, and we count on them to maintain our quality of life. But they are expensive, and they add time and money to the cost of construction. And finally, many projects that face community opposition, that is not to say that community opposition is wrong or bad, and it often produces better results and better products, but it also results in projects being delayed and more expensive to build. Next slide, please. So the state of California is stepping in, and they've gotten much more aggressive in recent years by adopting new laws and requirements and policies to get at the root causes of some of these factors. They've been particularly focused on eliminating constraints related to community processes and opposition to development. The laws that you see on the screen right here are only a small fraction of the bills that have been approved by the legislature and signed by the governor in the last 4 years. The town council will be getting an update on some of these laws at its October 27th meeting under housing legislative update. And we encourage you to tune in to that meeting on Zoom to learn more. And also, I just want to say, if you want a more in-depth understanding of this entire issue, on October 6th, the town council and the planning commission held a kickoff meeting with a more detailed look at all these issues. So these laws, these new laws that you're seeing, have completely changed the landscape for what local governments can and can't do regarding housing in California, and are a large part of why we're here today. So to tell you more about the housing in California, I'm going to turn it back to Barry Miller, who will introduce Matt Coda from BAE. Thank you.
Thanks, Afsha. And I'm going to introduce Matt Kauta in just a second to talk about the housing element and how it addresses some of the issues that Afsha just mentioned. Before we do that, we have a couple more. Actually, these are trivia questions rather than polling questions. So we want to see what you know about how many residents Moraga gained between 2010 and 2020. So we have new data from the census that was just released a little more than a month ago about the number of residents in the city. And here's the question, which is how many residents, in other words, people, did Moraga gain between 2010 and 2021? So this is how many residents did Moraga gain during that 10-year census period? And we'll see what you think. Give everyone just another minute to answer. Okay, so here's what folks said. Looks like we had a pretty even distribution across the choices here, but the answer is 850.
Oh,
Choice. Moraga gained 850 residents during the last 10 years. It was a little bit of a surprise. Let's go to the next question. I'm going to move along here. How many housing units did Moraga gain? So we gained 850 people. How many housing units were gained during that time period? We'll give this just another couple of seconds. Most folks have answered. And I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Oops, it's telling me that I can't share the results. Okay, well, let me give you the answer. It's 110. So half of you got it right. 110 residents were added and 110 homes were added and 850 residents were added. So what that means is we have more people per household, and actually the number of persons per household in Moraga actually went up between the last census and this census from 2.51 persons per household in 2010 to 2.66 persons per household today. So interesting bit of trivia there about the town. And with that, I'm going to introduce Matt Kauta, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the housing element. Matt.
Thank you, Barry, and good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Matt Kauta. I'm with BAE Urban Economics. We're a sub-consultant on the team, and we'll be working on a lot of the actual housing element content, as well as being a liaison between the town and the state representatives at Housing and Community Development to make sure that the element ultimately meets all the state requirements and gets certified as being legally compliant. So about the housing element, it's a guide to meeting local housing needs and addressing the kinds of challenges that Afshan had mentioned in her presentation. So it's your plan for meeting housing needs locally. This is not a new requirement. It's something that local jurisdictions have been required to do in California since 1969. It's one of the only elements of the housing element or of the general plan that has to be updated on a regular schedule, in this case, every 8 years. And it's also unique in that it's the only part of the general plan that's subject to the state's review and certification requirement. As a result, there are some very specific requirements defined in the government code about what needs to be included and covered in the housing element. And a key piece of that is the regional housing need allocation and accommodating a fair share of the housing need within the area for the 8-year planning period. Next slide, please. So as prescribed in state law, there are a number of elements that have to be included in the housing element, starting out with a housing needs assessment that covers demographic characteristics, employment trends, housing market conditions, special housing needs from different populations such as seniors, large households, disabled, farm workers, and areas where there's agriculture and so forth. Next component of the element is an evaluation of the effectiveness of the prior housing element and the progress made towards implementing that in terms of housing production and completion of various programs and actions that were identified. The housing element next goes into an evaluation of constraints to housing production, maintenance, and rehabilitation. And those include both governmental constraints from various levels, but taking a close look at the local governmental processes and procedures, environmental constraints, infrastructure constraints, community issues, and a range of non-governmental constraints such as availability of financing, cost of construction, and so forth. Next, the element will look at the resources to assist housing, and a really key piece of that is the availability of land to build housing. And again, that's a key responsibility of the housing element to lay out the housing sites inventory that will be able to accommodate the RHNA. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment. Finally, a section on furthering fair housing, and with AB 686 passed not too long ago, it's added substantial new requirements for evaluating fair housing issues within the community that were not part of the last housing element update. So we have some new requirements to meet, but essentially those are looking at how we can be a more inclusive community and avoid situations of discrimination and other factors that make it challenging for certain groups to obtain housing within the community. All of these analyses then lead into the identification of goals, objectives, and policies, as well as a specific set of actions for the housing element, which the community will undertake during that 8-year planning period once the housing element's adopted. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about this regional housing need allocation. This is something that, again, is not a choice per se for the community, but rather it's prescribed by state law. And it's kind of a top-down process where the state first identifies the number of housing units needed for each region in California. Then the councils of government within each region are responsible to create a process to distribute that regional assignment down to cities and counties. And ultimately, they need to distribute all of those units in some fashion. You can see at the bottom of the slide here that the Association of Bay Area Governments, which is our regional council of governments, also known as ABAG, was handed down a number of 441,000 housing units, which then had to be allocated out. Once local jurisdictions have their allocations, then the housing element update is the process to plan for how to accommodate that regional housing need allocation. So what did we end up with in Moraga? Next slide, please. Before I jump to that, we'll talk a little bit about how those units are distributed. So there's a 37-member advisory committee that ABAG formed over a year-long process involved in actually creating the formulas for making those allocations. Some of the key factors that play into the allocations were the size of the community, the proximity and availability of jobs, the availability of transit, the presence of high opportunity areas. And high opportunity means areas where there are resources and amenities that are conducive to the economic success of households. So think of things like good schools, other kinds of community resources, and things like medical care and so forth that will promote high achievement among young people and successful life outcomes for people of all ages. Next slide. Okay, so here's the number of units that we have for Moraga, just a little over 1,100 units. And this is a significant increase from the prior housing element period, where I think the number was just 229 units. And this isn't a number that literally translates to the city somehow initiating construction projects and building these units, but again, planning for the ability to accommodate those units, removing constraints, identifying sites where they could be built, and setting the stage essentially for the private sector, developers, property owners, and so forth to actually build the units. So let's talk a little bit about the breakdown of those units, because an important component of the RHNA is to accommodate housing for households at all income levels. Next slide. Oh, jumping ahead of myself again. Speaking to that issue of the significant increase in housing, the RHNA number. So you can see Moraga's was significantly higher in the orange bar versus the blue bar from the prior 5th cycle allocation. And this is similar throughout Contra Costa County. You can see those very large numbers in places like Walnut Creek and San Ramon, as well as significant increases in some of the smaller neighboring communities like Orinda, Lafayette, and Danville. Next slide. So what do these income levels mean? They're based on the area median income for the county, and they're defined as very low being up to 50% of area median income, low being up to 80, moderate being up to 120% of median, and above moderate being everything else. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see those income limits for a family of 4. They are adjusted depending on household size. Smaller household sizes will have somewhat lower income limits. What this translates to in terms of that overall 1,118 number is about 500 of the units are lower income, which combines both low income and very low income. You see 172 units for moderate and 445 for above moderate. The lower income units are presumed typically to need to be accommodated via multifamily housing at higher densities, which is the state's determination of the feasibility of developing affordable housing, really hinging to a great deal on the ability to build at higher densities. So you're needing to acquire less land per housing unit in order to build. So let's go to the next slide. So what is affordable housing? You take those income limits and you assume that a household, in order to be in affordable housing, should not be spending more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. Housing costs are not just rent or a mortgage payment, but there are other costs such as utilities. In the case of homeowners, also includes hazard insurance, property taxes, and so forth. It's the overall proportion of income that's spent to provide the housing. If you are spending more than 30% of your monthly household income on these housing costs, you're considered housing cost burdened. And that is an indication of households not being able to comfortably afford the housing that they're living in. Next slide. This one shows some typical rents within Moraga for apartment units, and the monthly rents advertised in sources such as Craigslist. And you can see these rents ranging from $2,000 a month to almost $3,600 per month, depending on the size of the unit. On the right-hand side in the red numbers there, you can see the calculation of what level of income would be necessary to afford those rent levels. You see it's quite high. And what this means is that typically households at incomes that are lower than these are going to have a hard time finding affordable market rate housing within the community, and instead might be either in a situation where they need to rely on some form of subsidized or assisted housing, or potentially paying more than that ideal 30% of income towards rent, which then creates stress in other parts of their budget in terms of being able to afford food, transportation, healthcare, educational costs, perhaps. So it's really a goal to provide this adequate supply of housing that's affordable for people at all income levels. And that ties directly back to that RHNA. So I think with that, we have gone through, and we're going to turn it back to Barry for some more trivia questions.
Thanks, Matt. This is our last trivia question, and that is, what is the median age in Moraga? And I think we're going to do this without setting it up as a poll. We'll just ask you to think about what the answer is to this question. And looks like there's some issue with the polling here, but we will reveal the answer momentarily. So the correct answer to this question is number 2, 43. 43 is the median age. And the interesting thing here about this is if you go back to 1980, the median age in the city was 34. So the city is aging. Half of the residents in Moraga are older than 43. Half of the residents are younger than 43. That's a higher median age than most of the communities in our vicinity. And it does represent the fact that it's difficult for folks who are in their 20s and 30s to find housing in Moraga. So we're going to move on into continuing to talk about the housing element. We have just a few more slides to go through, and we'll wrap up. So Matt mentioned in his presentation that the town needs to demonstrate that it has the capacity for 1,118 units of housing. And one of the purposes of the housing element, probably the one that the state is most interested in, is where those sites are located and how realistic is it that they can be developed. So we're required to provide detailed information to the state on every single housing site we identify. And then you may wonder, well, what counts? What can we count as a housing site? So that's what you see here in this bulleted list on the slide. We can count any project that's been approved that hasn't been built yet. We can count vacant land where housing is permitted in the town. So vacant lots in residential areas, which would generally be counted as single family homes, or vacant land in commercial areas where housing is allowed. So we can count underutilized commercial sites. And there again, now there's one of those terms that requires some clarification. What is an underused commercial site? We need to make the case to the state in our analysis that a site is underused, that it has a structure that may be vacant or a use that's not economically productive anymore, or that there are other projects, other sites in the vicinity that have been redeveloped with housing. So many of our potential housing sites are things like parking lots, areas where there may be an empty office building or a vacant building, and so on. So we're looking at those opportunities as well. And those are particularly concentrated in the Moraga Town Center area and in the Ream Park commercial area. There are a number of properties that are either vacant or underutilized that we'll be looking at as opportunities for future housing. We can also look at institutional properties in the town, including parts of St. Mary's if they're interested in developing housing, or churches that may have large areas of vacant or underused land, any surplus public property, and accessory dwelling units. So we have rules in the town that permit accessory dwellings, and we have an opportunity to count a certain number of those sites as potential housing units for low and moderate income households. So we're also required to affirmatively further fair housing in this process. And that's a new requirement that came out of a state law adopted in 2017. What this means is that we can't just identify sites and adopt policies and then put our housing element on a shelf for the next 8 years. We have to proactively work to encourage construction, reduce segregation, and promote equity in the way we build and sell and rent housing in the community. This requirement applies to every city and county in California right now. What comes with this new requirement is a lot of data that needs to be analyzed, including maps of segregation in every community, an analysis of lending practices, and even an evaluation of where our housing sites are located to make sure we're not concentrating all of the affordable housing in one location within the town on one site. So a big part of the work that needs to be done in the housing element is meeting these requirements. So one question that you may be asking yourself is what happens if we don't do this, if we don't comply? And there are consequences. It used to be that there were very minimal consequences, that the state didn't really step in if you didn't have a certified housing element, but that is changing. The most immediate consequence is the loss of state funds, not just for housing, but also for transportation. So the funds we rely on for repaving and maintaining our roads could be jeopardized if we don't have a certified housing element. We face the risk of lawsuits and attorney fees, and this has happened in other communities, as you see from some of the images on the screen. Places like Pleasanton have been sued. We also face fines and penalties from the state of California up to $600,000 a month. The most extreme would be to lose our land use and permitting authority and have that taken over by the state. I also want to point out that the state has the authority to decertify a housing element once it's been adopted, if they feel that the community is not doing enough to implement the programs that it's adopted. So number one, we want to have a certified housing element at the end of the day. And number two, we want to have realistic programs that we can implement. So we're going to move to the final group of slides here, which just gives a quick overview of our timeline. We've begun this process and are now in the fall of 2021. We're in the process of assessing our housing needs and looking at our sites. We will be looking at potential rezoning options in the event we need additional capacity. There are some opportunities that we'll be looking at. We'll be asking for your input as we evaluate those sites. The draft plan, the draft housing element, will be prepared primarily in the winter and spring months, and we'll be bringing that to the Planning Commission and Town Council for their consideration around May and June. I want to point out there's actually 2 steps to getting this plan completed. We have to submit a working draft to the state next summer, and they will give us comments back and say, here's what we want to see you change before we will certify this. And only after we have gotten to the point where they say, yes, you've done what we have required, will we bring it back to the Town Council for formal adoption. We need to do that by January of 2023. So all of the 101 cities and 9 counties in the Bay Area have a hard deadline of January 2023 to adopt their new housing elements. So in terms of participating and staying involved, we have a number of opportunities here. Notification emails, if you haven't signed up to be notified about future meetings, please send an email to the address at the bottom left, makemoraga@moraga.ca.us, and you'll be notified anytime there is a community discussion or a council meeting or a planning commission meeting. We want to encourage you to attend future meetings like this one. And as Afshar said, we do have another meeting on October 28th. That's Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Similar to this one, we'll be doing the same presentation, but providing another opportunity for input. Please do email any ideas you may have or thoughts about the housing element to the web address, the email address below. We're going to be doing an online housing survey in November with probably about a month or 2 to respond to that. That'll be on SurveyMonkey, and we'll be sending out notices about that. We are developing an online tool to help select our housing sites. So anyone can weigh in on where you think housing should be in the town. I mentioned the council and commission study sessions. There will be public hearings later on in the process. We're encouraging HOAs, neighborhood groups, and civic organizations to invite us to their meetings. We won't necessarily give you a 45-minute presentation, but we will be there to provide a quick overview of the project and answer questions and take feedback and ideas. And we also encourage you to contact state legislators. We know there are a lot of folks who may not be happy about the process and these assignments. Steve Glazer at the State Senate and Rebecca Bauer-Kahn at the State Assembly are our representatives, and you can share your views with them. Most of what we're doing now is a result of new state legislation that's been adopted in the last 5 years, and we do need to provide that feedback. So for the rest of the time we have with you today, we have about 40 minutes. We would appreciate your hearing your issues and concerns, your thoughts related to housing, any ideas you may have about where new housing should be, ways to meet the town's housing needs, or questions about the material that we presented. With that, I'm going to end the screen share and we'll turn it to our audience for questions. We do want to encourage you to use the raise hand feature if you have a question, and we will call on you as we see those hands going up. And great, I'm going to call on Ellen Beans. We don't have we're not in a webinar format, so we're all at the same level here, and any of you can speak when we call on you. You don't, we're going to encourage you to limit your comments to 3 minutes or less, just to make sure everybody has a chance to be heard. Ellen, you're okay to go ahead if you want to ask a question or make a comment.
Okay, I want some clarification in relationship to the housing number that we have this go around and what it was 8 years ago. I was involved in paying attention to that process. So there was a number of units that were designated as part of that 229. And a lot of that has not been built on. Very little has been built on. So what happens? Do we add more than now to make and those formally designated sites to fill that 229 number? They don't count, or they do count, even though they haven't been built on?
Ellen, that's an excellent question. I can respond to that. So the answer is we can carry forward those sites that we identified last time if they're still available, with some caveats. We need to make sure that if a project is proposed on one of those sites that has affordable units in it, that it receives a streamlined approval path. So we can continue to count those sites that we counted last time. And you're right, there were a lot of them. There were 800 units. Although we only got an assignment of 229 in our housing element, we demonstrated to the state that we had the capacity for 800 units. And we're going to be carrying whatever's left, whatever is still available of those sites, we're going to be carrying those forward.
Okay.
It is not as big a gap as it may sound. We're basically short by about, 300 to 400 plus a buffer of units in case we lose some sites over the next 8 years. But we're not rezoning 800 units worth of new sites.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Other questions? Okay, Gail?
Okay, I have a question. How does St. Mary's College fit into these formulas? Housing for their students on campus, et cetera, et cetera.
Also a great question. St. Mary's is a large employer, a big presence in the community. If they're planning housing, then we will count those housing units, provided that they're apartment units, and we can't count dormitories.
Okay.
Planning student housing or housing that's only for students, those units we cannot count toward our RHNA. If they're building apartments and those apartments are available to non-students or to families and so on, it's debatable. I mean, I've seen those units counted in other communities. If it's students only, they generally can't be counted. That said, you know, we're going to be working with St. Mary's. They have a stake in the game here, and they, you know, they have a student population that needs housing, and we're going to be looking at that need and engaging them in this discussion as we move through this. Thank you. And I see Kristen has her hand up, and then we'll go with Colette after that.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to say thank you for having this meeting over the lunch hour. I know it's your lunch hour too, but for people who work and then also have like carpool and responsibilities in the evening, it's really nice to be able to know it's more likely that we'll get here. So I just wanted to say thank you. I also have a question about the process that it sounds like this process has been in place with variations since 1969. But kind of the new reality of our Firewise post-Paradise world is that high density populations that have limited evacuation routes are going to be in greater risk scenarios than we've ever seen before. And I know that there are building codes and spark resistant materials available to us now, but we also know that, you know, if a fire sweeps down through Canyon, evacuation routes are going to be pretty crowded, especially because the same additional units, I assume, are going to be in the towns that we go through to get to safety. So I wondered if there was any at the state level or the local level or any level, your office level, kind of layering of the need for evacuation routes and safety alongside the compliance and critical need for affordable and high density and low density and all the other housing needs that need to be addressed. Have those two things been looked at together?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll take a first shot at responding, and I welcome any you know, Matt or Afshar if you want to add on to this. Couple of things. So first of all, this was an argument that the town used, that other communities in the area used when that formula was being developed, and we saw the numbers we were getting, which is, you know, you're putting a lot of housing, you're putting the burden of providing a lot of housing on communities that have limited ingress and egress, or communities that have areas that are very high fire hazard severity. And can't your formulas and your allocations reduce the assignments in those communities? And there were some adjustments done to the model to reduce the assignments, but not enough. And so, you know, we are left with these really high numbers, which, you know, I think we find we have the same concerns and issues. That said, we also are going to have to amend the safety element of our general plan as part of the housing element to look at the very issues you just mentioned. So we need to map evacuation routes. We need to map all neighborhoods with one means of ingress and egress. We need to work with the fire department and hear the concerns and make sure that we're planning for evacuation and water capacity and things like that as part of this process. So that's part of what we're doing. We also have to do an environmental impact report as part of the housing element. And one of the things that EIR will address is fire hazard and you know, water supply and pressure and things related to fire hazards and evacuation. So we are coordinating this effort with the Moraga-Orinda Fire District and addressing issues around evacuation and fire hazards as part of this.
Yeah, and I just want to comment on this. One of the things as we are doing the safety element is we will have to work with Lafayette and Orinda, our surrounding jurisdictions during the safety element process and look at all the impacts. So that's coming up. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you. And I actually have to drop off to go back to work, but I didn't want you to think it was because of your answer. I really appreciated your answer. So thank you very much.
So before you guys leave, could you please email me and or add yourselves to the notify me list on our website, Make Moraga Home. That way we can keep you updated on upcoming meetings and updates.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
just emailed them Make Moraga Home. So thank you.
Thanks. I see a question from Colette Clark. Colette?
Yeah, hi. Actually, Kristen just did a great job asking the question that I had. I was concerned about, ingress and egress routes. And so it sounds like it's on the table. Thank you.
Thanks. And Mike?
Hi, I was wondering if you could clarify what exactly compromises a housing unit? Because obviously there's a big difference between a one-bedroom apartment or a studio apartment and a house that can accommodate a family of 5. So if you could just to what degree do we get credit if we produce studio apartments or one-bedroom apartments?
Matt, do you want to reply to that?
Sure. Thank you. Another good question. So a housing unit would include its own cooking facilities and bathroom facilities. So essentially, a studio would typically qualify and would be credited as one housing unit, just the same as if it was a 5 or 8 bedroom, very large house. And it kind of goes back to that discussion about the college and student housing. So dormitories, because they don't have those independent self-contained living units, a large dormitory unit that might have 800 beds capacity would only be counted as one housing unit because it'd be considered a group quarters unit. So other facilities such as, say, a assisted living facility that had a number of residents in it that don't have their own fully independent units would also be considered a group quarters and not get that full credit for all the different separate units within it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, Mike, that we're going to be pretty aggressive about counting accessory dwelling units, potential accessory dwelling units or ADUs. And if we have the data showing what the rents are for those and can show that some of them at least are affordable to lower income households based on, the fact that the rent is, say, $1,500 or $1,400 a month, we will be meeting some of our need that way. At this point, most of the ADUs are higher, they're higher priced than that, but there may be small ADUs, bedrooms that become their own unit and so on, that we can count as being affordable to lower income households. Other questions? I'm not seeing any hands raised in the, okay, we have one from Ellen.
Yeah, I just want to, when we talked about the safety issue and the fire issue, I know that the MOFD has specified the parking lot in front of the Osh building as a gathering place for residents if we have to evacuate our neighborhood. So if that should be designated as a building site as an underserved space, that whole issue would have to be rethought because that seems that was exciting to me, that would be a place we could go if it was endangered here in my neighborhood. But if that is taken away with building, then that has to be rethought by MOFD and other people involved.
I want to kind of put on my hat to try and channel Police Chief King in saying that, well, there has been discussion about the Osh site serving as a temporary refuge. There are other sites as well. And based upon the incident, they would identify which site was appropriate. So I think that it's important that people don't rush off and go there and think that that's the place to go. You really need to use Nixle and the community warning system because there could be other sites. For example, during the Merrill fire, people met at St. Monica's Church. So just wanted to clarify that piece so that the information was out there. Thank you.
Yes, and I also want to add to that, that you need to go to Zone Haven and put in your particular address, and it will tell you which areas, in case there's an evacuation, that you need to go to. So Osh may not be serving you the best. It all depends on where you live.
Yes, Mary?
Hi, can you help me understand how, I guess, who is responsible? I guess maybe it's the developer, and I'm not sure who after that, for, I guess, maybe initially establishing what the pricing is for either rents or buying any of these units at the prescribed income level or cost level, and how that's maintained over time? I mean, is that all being monitored, or how does that work?
Yeah, another great question, and I'll start off, and Matt, you may want to add on to this. But essentially, there's two types of housing that we'd be looking at. One that's built by the private developer, the private sector, and the other that would be built by nonprofits. And so, if you're a private developer, you set whatever price you want. The town could adopt an ordinance that requires that a certain percentage of the units are limited to households earning below a certain income. That's a policy decision that the town of Moraga would need to make. Right now, we don't have a requirement like that, so developers can build at whatever price point they want. If you're a nonprofit developer, then you're typically using tax credits or grants or some funding that's coming from the government, that the strings attached to that are that you are limiting your rents or sale prices to certain caps that are set by the state or federal governments, and that you're only able to charge rents or sell those homes to persons with incomes below certain thresholds. That nonprofit sector has not done that much in Moraga in the past. They've built things in places like Orinda and Walnut Creek and Lafayette. We haven't seen a whole lot here. We could in the future. There, the issue is how much funding is available, how much tax credit money is out there. And but right now, what we're primarily seeing are private, just for-profit developers building and setting whatever price the market will bear. So it's all up to the developer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just add to that there are kind of generally those two buckets of housing units: the regulated affordable housing units that are under some sort of formal agreement that they maintain affordable rent levels or sales prices, and then market rate units where what's charged for them can just vary depending on the market, but typically are not going to be affordable to your lower income, and in many cases not even moderate income households. But the accessory dwelling units are one example of a type of unit that may actually be affordable based on a market rent, where it's not being regulated formally. So they may start out as being relatively affordable, maybe to a moderate income household because of their small size, or because it's a homeowner who's renting to a low price to, say, a family member or something like that. They're creating some affordability, but over time, depending on the choices that the property owner makes, those could become more or less affordable. And so what was one day an affordable unit could become a market rate unit. It just depends. And that's something that is going to vary depending on market conditions as they change over time.
Okay, other questions? Either I see Gail has a question.
Do you foresee the town of Moraga starting a campaign or an initiative to encourage residents to create ADUs and granny units on their properties?
Afsha, what do you think?
Yeah, what we have seen is, so first of all, we have adopted the ordinances for accessory dwelling units or granny units. And they are being done at the staff level. And we're turning those around pretty quickly. So it is what we're calling like a streamlined review. And the state has also made it easier to do those. And so we are following the state requirements. We can certainly look at other initiatives to encourage more of those during this housing element process and see what's available and what's working for other towns as well. We have seen an increase of those types of projects coming in for our review. But I will also say we haven't seen like a huge influx either. You know, it's not like all of a sudden our numbers went up from, 0 to 50%. So that is an area that we can continue to look at.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that in addition to the process being streamlined, the fees are dramatically reduced, which is an incentive. And we'd love your feedback, everybody's feedback during this process, because I mean, there's two real questions related to ADUs, and one is we can use it as a form of affordable housing if people deed restrict the units so that they maintain affordability, and that really helps with meeting our goals. But the second issue is that some cities have gone and kind of created kind of standardizations and templates to really help residents build that second unit, kind of to already have some plans available. So, Moraga is a little bit unique in terms of what the designs might be, but if we hear that that's something that the community wants, and that would be beneficial as a project, then we can take that information forward to the council. Does that answer your question?
Other questions or comments? I'm looking for raised hands or anybody who wants to turn their camera on and just add anything or make a comment before we wrap up.
And you can always email us the comments or give us a call if you, don't want to speak in front of a large group. We really want to hear what you have to say.
I'll just quickly chime in to thank you. This was great. I look forward to continuing to participate. I will write you with some other thoughts, but I also am hoping and expecting that all these different meetings that you talked about where we can further engage the different town council meetings and the meeting you want us to promote to other people, which I assume is a repeat of this meeting. I hope there's a page on the website that's really dedicated to this process. So, if you lose your thread, you have a place to go reground yourself on what the process is and how to plug into the various stages. That's always really helpful. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marty. And that's actually a good plug for us to once again give you that URL, which is it's www.makemoraga.home.org. So if you go to makemoraga.home.org, you will land on a page that's completely dedicated to the housing element. And what we'll be doing is all meetings will be posted on that page. All documents related to the project will be there. If you go there now, you'll find links to the last housing element from 8 years ago, as well as some of the state requirements that we are doing. We're meeting right now. And when we get our survey up, everything is going to be on that site. And that lives within the town of Moraga's website. So you can also find your way there that way, but Make Moraga Home was an easy
Great.
land
And
on.
will the PowerPoint that was presented today be there? Because there was some really interesting data in that I think I'd like to share with people, and that will be there.
It will be there, and this presentation and actually this entire meeting, including the Q&A, will be on the web by probably a week from now. So you can stream the meeting. If you know someone who wasn't here, who couldn't make it, they can watch the meeting after the fact. We mentioned the October 28th meeting. That is the same presentation we gave today. Maybe a different audience with some different questions. You're all welcome to come back and be part of that meeting as well. We invite you to do that.
But the slideshow will be separate from the streaming, so to get access to the slides. Yeah,
Yeah, they'll both be there.
great.
Right, one will be a PDF file.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I don't see any other questions or comments. Cynthia, did you want to have the last word?
Thank you. Thank you for setting aside time. And it was great to see the number of people that came at lunch, and we will take that into consideration in scheduling of future meetings. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again at future meetings. Bye now.